Spain conquered empires. Mexico fell. Peru collapsed. The Caribbean was chained to a crown. But in southern Chile, the empire came to a halt. For 3 centuries, the Mapuche refused to disappear. They burned cities, captured governors, mastered the horse, and forced Spain to recognize a border. Not a myth, not a legend, a frontier written into history. So, what happens when the world's most powerful empire meets a people who refuse to be conquered? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Spain conquered empires across the Americas. Capitals fell, temples were stripped, and entire coastlines learned new flags. But in southern Chile, the conquest hit a wall and stayed there. Listen to the Bio River at dawn. On one bank, a Spanish fort wakes under fog, wood soaked and nails rusting. On the other bank, a Toki raises a lance, and smoke drifts over Araucania. The empire's map stops here. Wait, notice that. Zoom out, because the scale matters. In Mexico, the great city was taken and remade. In Peru, the mountain empire was torn apart and chained to silver. Across the Caribbean, islands were turned into plantations and ports, as if the sea itself had been deeded to a king. Spain learned a method: steel, horses, disease, alliances, and paperwork. Then the method rode south. It reached Chile, and suddenly it stalled, as if the road ended. Spain's method often began the same way: find the throne, seize the ruler, and let fear outrun any horse. In Mexico and Peru, alliances with rivals, epidemics, and the capture of elites cracked empires from within. Then Spanish courts wrote victory into law, turning conquest into paperwork. But look closer at Chile. There was no single emperor to replace, no capital whose fall meant the land was taken. Spain brought a key for a different lock. When people say Spain never conquered the Mapuche, this is what they mean. Spain founded towns, raised forts, and held territory in Chile, but it never achieved lasting rule over Mapu south of the river. Again and again, it was forced into a managed frontier, into negotiated limits, into politics under open sky. Spain could fight here, it could bleed here, it could not finish here. This is not a nationalist bedtime story where one people is painted as flawless and the other as monsters. The battlefield keeps count, and the count is heavy. It is a historical tension that lasts centuries, not years. From the mid-16th century onward, Mapuche communities resisted, adapted, negotiated, and fought. Spain was forced into treaties. A recognized frontier emerged. That frontier endured so long that it shaped a country's imagination. That is the contradiction we are walking into. Now come closer to the land, because the land is a character here. Southern Chile is not gentle to marching armies. Rivers braid and flood. Forests close like doors. Rain turns roads into traps, and mud clings to boots as if it wants to keep you. The Bio River runs wide and cold, swelling with seasons, shifting its own edges, refusing to be a simple line on a governor's map. In that weather, a fort is never finished. In that weather, conquest has to earn every step. Long before it became a political border, the Bio was a working river. Canoes, footbridges, seasonal crossings, stories carried on mist. For the Spanish, it became a problem to be solved through engineering and orders. For the Mapuche, it was a companion that could hide tracks, break formations, and swallow heavy armor. Watch a scout kneel at its edge, tasting the water as if it could tell the future. In this war, it often could. Before the ships, the Mapuche were already many worlds at once. River valleys where corn, beans, and potatoes fed families. Coastal edges where fishing and salt met the wind. Forest paths where medicine grew, and where memory traveled by foot. In the high country, ancient pine trees dropped heavy seeds, and people gathered them with patience older than any crown. They were not an empire with one throne. They were a web of communities tied by kinship, exchange, and obligation. Their politics did not climb a single ladder. It moved in circles. Local leaders guided their own people, but decisions were argued and negotiated, not simply ordered. Disputes could be settled through council and ceremony as much as through force. Power depended on respect, on the ability to persuade, to provide, to protect. That matters, because when outsiders arrived, the Mapuche did not meet them as scattered individuals. They met them as people who already knew how to organize themselves without a palace. Land was not a piece of property that could be sold and forgotten. It was a living network of places with obligations, fields, rivers, burial grounds, sacred groves, and ancestral paths. When communities gathered for a ceremony, they were not only praying, they were renewing alliances, settling conflicts, and deciding how to protect what kept them alive. That is why the invasion was not just an insult, it was a rupture, and ruptures demand response. And then war forced that organization to change shape. In times of danger, communities could choose a war leader, a toki, whose authority was tied to the campaign rather than to a permanent crown. Warriors gathered, trained, dispersed, and returned. Messengers ran along rivers and ridges, carrying news faster than a soldier could march. Alliances formed across regions, only to loosen when the emergency passed. The Mapuche could centralize enough to resist, but not enough to be easily captured. That flexibility becomes a weapon, and Spain never learns how to disarm it. When the Spaniards arrived in Chile, they carried the confidence of recent victories. Pedro de Valdivia pushed south, founding towns, raising crosses, naming rivers as if naming was the same as owning. The colonists sought gold and labor because conquest without profit is a wound that never heals. Forts rose like splinters in the landscape. Fields were demanded. Bodies were demanded. The letters admit it in polite language. Forced labor, tribute, and punishment were treated as normal tools of rule. In 1541, Santiago was founded in dust and ambition, and it nearly burned before it learned to stand. That early shock did not humble the conquerors for long. They kept building with straight lines, as if geometry could tame a continent. Concepcion, Imperial, Valdivia, Villarica, names written on maps before the land was agreed upon. Every new town was a claim, and every claim demanded enforcement. The Spanish were not only fighting people, they were fighting the consequences of their own promises. At first, there was curiosity, a new animal with thunder in its chest, a metal that cuts wood like bread, a sound like lightning from a tube. But curiosity quickly turned to conflict when the Spanish began taking people, food, and land and calling it law. Strangers building walls and treating free people like property. That is when the Arauco War begins, in the mid-16th century, and it refuses to give you a clean ending. It stretches, breaks, reforms, and stretches again. Picture a Spanish fort at dawn, a palisade of logs, a ditch, a cannon pointed toward trees that never stop moving. Inside, soldiers scrape damp powder from a horn, praying it will still fire. Outside, the forest holds silence like a blade. This is where the story shifts. Spain's style of conquest depended on taking a center and declaring victory. But here, there is no single center to seize. There are many hearths, many paths, and many ways to disappear. One name rises early like a spark in wet wood, Lautaro. The records show he learned Spanish cavalry from close enough to smell the horse's sweat. He watched saddles tighten and lances lowered. He listened to commands, studied routines, and then escaped back to his people, carrying knowledge that could not be unlearned. He did not bring magic, he brought intelligence. He proved that the frontier was not only a place of resistance, but a place of learning, and learning can be sharper than steel. On December 25th, 1553, Valdivia marched toward a fort he believed was secure near Tucapel. Confidence is a kind of blindness. Mapuche fighters struck with coordination, not chaos. They cut supply lines, surrounded the position, and turned Spanish discipline into a trap. Valdivia was captured. His death, however it happened, landed like thunder in Santiago. An empire used to swallowing worlds tasted something new, the fear of not being able to finish what it began. But look closer. That battle is not only a victory, it is a lesson in adaptation. The Mapuche had seen horses and steel and decided neither was untouchable. They began to study the enemy's habits, weapons, and weaknesses. They took what they could, not to become Spanish, but to survive Spanish pressure. The Spanish, instead of leaving, doubled down. They sent more men, built more forts, founded more towns, and promised themselves that time would do the conquering. Time in this land did not take their side. The war turned into a pattern of pressure and reply. Spanish commanders tried to punish villages into obedience. Villages moved, scattered, and returned. The Mapuche struck at weak points, roads, outposts, isolated farms, the thin thread of supply that kept a fort alive. They attacked at night, in the rain, in places where cavalry could not run. When the Spanish tried to force a decisive battle, the forest refused to offer one. The battlefield keeps count of victories that happen in mud, not marble. Another name carries weight, heavy with tragedy. Caupolicán, chosen as a toki, He led with the stubborn calm of someone who knows the stakes. The letters admit he was captured, and the Spanish made a spectacle of his death, hoping terror would end resistance. Instead, terror taught memory. Every brutal execution was meant to close the story. Often it opened it wider, turning grief into resolve and stories into strategy. Violence here does not erase, it engraves. And resistance was not limited to one kind of body, one kind of voice. The records remember women who fought, commanded, and refused to be ornaments in anyone's narrative. Janakio is one of those names, moving through the late 16th century like a blade in the dark. Mentioning her is not about making a legend, it is about admitting reality. Communities under invasion use every kind of leadership they can find. When survival is at stake, courage is not gendered, it is chosen. Do not imagine the Mapuche as one unbroken fist, they argued. They competed. Some communities chose accommodation, hoping to survive by bending the rules. Others chose war. Alliances shifted like river currents, and that flexibility, ironically, became an advantage. Spain could not cut off one head and end the struggle because there was no single head. War leaders rose, served, and could be replaced. Authority traveled through trust, not titles, that made decapitation strategies fail again and again. Listen for hooves. At first, the horse belonged to Spain like a secret. Then it escaped. The Mapuche learned to ride, and in that learning, distance changed. Horse and rider turned days into hours. Raids could reach farther, retreat faster, strike harder, and vanish before dawn. Spanish letters admit with frustration that the enemy now moved with the same speed they once bragged about. The empire had brought a weapon, and the frontier learned to wield it without asking permission. Steel and horses were not the only lessons carried across the line. Muskets, too, were studied. A captured weapon became a teacher. How to load, how to keep powder dry, how to aim through smoke. The Mapuche did not have Spanish factories, but they had patience and improvisation. They learned to take guns as prizes and to time attacks. For the moment, a soldier had to reload. The letters admit the surprise. The enemy was no longer only in the trees. The enemy could answer fire with fire. Spain believed towns could tame the land, so they planted them like stakes, straight streets, churches, public squares, and forts guarding the edges. Each settlement demanded food, gunpowder, and men who did not want to die in the rain. Each settlement created a target. And each time a fort fell, Spain rebuilt it, because empires hate admitting limits. Yet rebuilding also meant bleeding. Chile became a costly corner of an empire chasing richer prizes elsewhere. The frontier made Spain spend itself, coin by coin. Wait, notice the geography again. Rivers are not just water here. They are barriers, corridors, and traps. Forests hide movement and swallow sound. Mountains squeeze weather into endless storms. The Bio floods and shifts, erasing bridges like chalk. For armies trained on open fields, this terrain is a slow poison. For people born inside it, the terrain is a map written into muscle. The land remembers every army that tried to march as if the weather did not matter. By the late 16th century, Spain convinced itself that the hard work was done. A chain of settlements reached south, bells rang, officials wrote reports that sounded like victory. Then came a night that changed the tone of every letter afterward. On December 23rd, 1598, near Curalaba, a Spanish force was ambushed. The governor Martín García Oñez de Loyola was killed. The battlefield keeps count, not only bodies, but the shock that followed. The empire learned what it meant to be hunted. After Curalaba, the frontier erupted. Mapuche communities rose in a broad uprising, and Spanish towns in the south began to fall. Houses burned, churches collapsed, streets laid out with imperial confidence, filled with ash. Later, people called it the destruction of the cities, as if cities were innocent objects. The land remembers it as a clearing of intrusions, a rejection of walls built without consent. Spain retreated north, gripping a smaller strip of territory and a stubborn dream. Smoke drifted over Araucania for years. Empires respond to humiliation with cruelty. The colony turned to harsh policies, punitive raids, forced relocations, and the legalization of slavery for captives labeled enemies. It was profit dressed as discipline. People were treated like loot. Some commanders used mutilation as a message, cutting hands, noses, ears, anything that could be displayed as a warning. Even in those days, some priests denounced such terror. The letters admit it in cold language, as if paperwork could wash blood from hands. It cannot. One Spanish pattern repeats in many frontiers. and the records do not hide it. First, seize the leaders, because a community without guidance is easier to bend. Second, break bodies to break will, using torture not only to punish but to broadcast fear. Third, make massacres public, in public squares or sacred places, so memory itself becomes a weapon against the survivors. Some officials call this necessary discipline. The land remembers it as organized cruelty, and organized cruelty creates organized resistance. One detail from far to the east keeps whispering. In frontier ground, there are burials where hands and parts of forearms are missing. The soil cannot tell you every story. It cannot name every perpetrator. It cannot prove intent in every case. But the absence still points toward a world where punishment was meant to be seen, where bodies could be turned into announcements. The pattern matches what the records describe. Terror used as policy, pain used as a message. This is not a spectacle for entertainment. It is the shadow a frontier leaves behind. The Mapuche answered with a different kind of discipline, not marching in shining lines, but coordinating across valleys and ridges. They learned which forts were weak, which commanders were arrogant, and which seasons made Spanish supply impossible. They captured horses and weapons, but also captives, because frontier wars are cruel mirrors. Still, resistance did not mean endless battle. Sometimes it meant refusing to give the enemy the decisive victory they needed to claim completion. To endure is to deny the conqueror a final scene. Around 1612, the Spanish crown tried a new plan, pushed by a Jesuit priest named Luis de Valdivia. Instead of charging south with swords, he urged a defensive line, missionary contact, and limits on enslaving captives. The Biobio River was treated more openly as a boundary, a place to hold rather than cross. On paper, it sounded like conscience. On the ground, it sounded like another strategy to soften resistance. The frontier tested the plan with the only language it trusted: consequences. The defensive war policy meant that forts were strengthened on the northern bank, soldiers were paid to stand and wait, and missionaries were sent across to preach. They were received with caution and sometimes with rage. Several were killed, and the policy unraveled. Spain learned a bitter truth. You cannot evangelize at spear point and call it peace. You cannot demand surrender and call it dialogue. By the mid-16th century, the colony slid back into hard war, and the river kept swallowing promises. Containment became an obsession. Commanders rebuilt forts, raided south, and tried to break Mapuche coordination by terror and division. Some Mapuche leaders chose to negotiate. Others chose to attack. War was not constant thunder. It was seasons of tension, sudden raids, uneasy truces, then fire again. The Biobio watched both sides grow older. Boots and hooves wore paths into its banks. And still the empire did not cross for good. The line held not by peace, but by failure. Here is where many stories collapse, because they want one ending. This war refuses. Instead, it gives you meetings. Under an open sky, with food laid out and weapons kept close, Spanish officials and Mapuche leaders began holding formal councils. The Spanish called them parliaments. The Mapuche arrived with their own protocols, their own memory, their own demands. This was not a surrender. This was politics, spoken aloud, face to face. It is harder to dramatize than a charge, but it changes history more deeply. Picture the treaty table under an open sky, a rough plank balanced on barrels. A Spanish scribe dips a quill, ink trembling in cold air. Across from him, a Mapuche leader speaks slowly, not for theater, but for clarity. Translators carry words across a gap that is not only language, but worldview. Gifts are exchanged, prisoners discussed, forts named, boundaries argued. In this world, diplomacy is another battlefield. Every sentence is a maneuver. Every pause is a threat. The most famous of these gatherings came in 1641 at Quilin. After decades of raids and reprisals, Spain and Mapuche leaders agreed on a framework that treated the Biobio as a frontier. The letters admit that Spain recognized that south of that line, Mapuche communities governed themselves. It was not a love letter to equality. It was an admission of limits. An empire that conquered continents accepted a border, and that border had a river's patience. But look closer, because treaties are living things, and living things can bite. Quilin did not end the war. It reshaped it. Some forts were withdrawn, captives exchanged, trade routes reopened, and messengers carried promises that might hold until the next crisis. On the ground, tension remained. Settlers still wanted land. Leaders still watched for betrayal. The Biobio kept flowing, indifferent to signatures. A treaty is a bridge, and bridges can be burned. So, what did a frontier mean in practice? It meant a chain of forts at dawn, smoke rising from chimneys that never quite felt safe. It meant patrols and scouts, cattle raids and counter raids. It meant traders risking the crossing with iron tools and cloth, returning with livestock, hides, and silverwork. It meant captives who became family in unfamiliar homes. It meant interpreters whose tongues carried power. The frontier was not a wall, it was a market with a knife under the table. Peace used the way a strategist uses terrain. A truce could be a pause to harvest, to move families, to train riders, to choose a new toki. A treaty could be a shield against surprise attacks or a stage to expose Spanish weakness. Sometimes there were false pieces, not as sport, but as survival under pressure. The record shows Spanish officials complained about this, calling it treachery. That complaint is proof of Mapuche political intelligence. It means Spain could not control the tempo. Spain adapted too. It stopped dreaming of quick conquest and started paying for a permanent frontier army. Money traveled south from Lima, a royal subsidy meant to keep soldiers fed and forts repaired. Chile, once a side project, became a military borderland demanding constant funding. Soldiers learned Mapuche style, ambush, scouting, and patience. Mapuche fighters learned Spanish routines, sentry shifts, supply schedules, the weak moment before dawn. Each side became the other's teacher, unwillingly. The frontier was a school that never closed. With time, the frontier produced something unusual for a far corner of the empire, a professional military routine. Soldiers were paid to stand on the line year after year, not as temporary conquerors, but as permanent border guards. Fort commanders became politicians. Supply officers became as important as cavalry captains. The colony learned to measure its life in shipments of powder, in payroll lists, in the arrival of that annual money from the north. Conquest turned into maintenance. Maintenance is what you do when you cannot win. Zoom in on a small detail, a boot crusted with mud on a fort's wooden platform as the sun rises. The soldier scans trees, listening for hooves, for a musket crack, for a shout in the dark. He has been told the enemy is wild, but he has watched them move with discipline. He has been told the frontier is secure, but he sleeps with his weapon close. Fear is a kind of education. He learns the river is not a protection. It is a question asked every morning. Across the Bio, a toki raises a lance. Not for your poster, not for legend, but as a practical signal. A line forms, then dissolves, because Mapuche warfare was never only about standing and dying in place. It was about choosing when to appear, when to vanish, when to strike, and when to talk. The lance points toward a fort, then toward the sky, then toward home. Leadership here is motion, not marble. Strategy is a language spoken with feet. In the mid-17th century, the war flared again. Uprisings erupted, and Spanish settlements felt the heat. In 1655, a wave of attacks shook the frontier, reminding Spain that treaties did not erase grievances. Forts burned, farms emptied. The Spanish rebuilt, because that is what empires do when they cannot admit they are guests. Then they return to the treaty table, because that is what empires do when steel alone fails. The cycle tightened, raid, rebuild, negotiate, and repeat. Over the late 17th century, the frontier settled into something like a grim routine. The legal market for enslaving captives weakened as royal policy shifted and profits changed. But do not confuse that with mercy. Violence remained, only redirected, managed, and bureaucratized. Parliaments continued. Trade expanded, raids still came like storms, yet the very repetition of treaty gatherings mattered. Each meeting, each exchange, each boundary reaffirmed was Spain admitting again that it did not rule south of the river. Recognition became a habit. The frontier became an economy, and economies changed people. Cattle and horses moved across the line. Iron tools, cloth, and alcohol flowed south. Hides, livestock, and craftsmanship flowed north. Some Mapuche leaders gathered goods and redistributed them, strengthening alliances. Some Spanish merchants made fortunes in the gray spaces where law and need shook hands. Captives became relatives. Interpreters became power brokers. Missionaries tried to plant belief in soil already full of spirits and memory. Resistance did not mean isolation. It meant choosing what to take and what to refuse. Here is another micro reveal. Spain never fully understood that Mapuche decentralization was not a weakness, it was defense. Without a single capital, there was no palace to occupy and declare victory. Authority could tighten into a confederation during a crisis and loosen in peace, like a net thrown and retrieved. Spain tried to exploit division by recruiting indigenous allies, and sometimes it worked for a season. But alliances shifted. Those who fought with Spain one year could fight against them the next. The frontier turned certainty into sand. If you want the strongest mainstream explanation for Mapuche endurance, it is not mysterious. Geography favored defenders who knew every river and ridge. Mapuche leadership adapted, choosing war leaders for campaigns and coordinating across regions without becoming easy to decapitate. They adopted horses and weapons, changing the balance. Spain faced long supply lines, a poor colony, and other wars across an overstretched empire. Diplomacy became necessary. None of this requires myth. It requires attention and the humility to let complexity stand. Nationalist stories sometimes paint as invincible heroes who never lost, or as a pure nation untouched by contact. The land remembers something more complicated. Communities suffered, were relocated, endured hunger, disease, and mourning. They also traded, intermarried, and incorporated new tools. Some became allies of Spain for their own reasons. Resistance was not a museum display. It was a living strategy shaped by circumstance and choice. Respect means holding that complexity, not sanding it down for comfort. And Spain was not one mind either. Governors changed. Priests argued with soldiers. The crown issued decrees that frontier commanders ignored. Some Spaniards condemned brutality. Others practiced it with zeal. Yet over time, the language in their reports shifted. Early letters are full of conquest certainty. Later letters sound like management, budgets, garrisons, negotiations, complaints about broken promises. That shift is a quiet defeat. When an empire starts talking like a landlord rather than a conqueror, it has already learned its limits. A Spanish soldier poet once tried to turn this war into an epic, praising the courage of the very people Spain could not subdue. It is strange, almost ironic. The empire that sought obedience produced literature that respected resistance. Do not mistake that for equality. Admiration can be another weapon, but it reveals something real. The Spanish frontier was feared not only, it was fascinating that they were facing a political people, not a faceless mass. Zoom out again to the wider world. While this frontier simmered, Spain fought in Europe, guarded treasure fleets, battled rival empires, and managed rebellions from the Andes to the Caribbean. Chile offered no mountain of silver like Potosí, no grand capital like Mexico. It offered rain, forests, and a war that ate money. So the crown compromised. It held a line. It paid soldiers to hold. It was accepted that the BOBO would remain a border that could not be erased. That acceptance is the shape of defeat without surrender. Then return to the frontier, to daily life. Smoke drifted over Araucanía, not only from battle, but from cooking fires. A child learns to ride, and in that learning is the future of war and trade. A woman carries news between families, and in that news is diplomacy. A messenger runs a path, and in that running is coordination. The Mapuche did not resist by becoming a mirror of Spain. They resisted by staying adaptable inside their own world, and by refusing to let the invader define what was possible. By the 18th century, parliaments were almost a system. Meetings at places like Negrete and others reaffirmed trade and boundaries, argued over captives, and regulated who could cross and why. Mapuche leaders negotiated from a position of recognized strength, and Spanish officials respected them because the alternative was fire. Yet the frontier never became a simple peace. It remained a relationship built on vigilance. A fort at dawn still listened for hooves. A toki still watched the river. The border lived. When independence movements rose in the early 19th century, the frontier did not dissolve. The Spanish crown weakened, but the BOBO still ran cold. New leaders in Santiago spoke of a nation, but Mapuche communities had their own politics and their own memory of treaties. Some Republicans wanted an alliance. Some wanted expansion. The same old desire for land returned, wearing a new uniform. The mountains were already teaching empires to negotiate, long before the names that filled textbooks. The frontier was older than the republic. Early Republican Chile, shaky and hungry for legitimacy, often continued the old habit of negotiating. New officials still met Mapuche leaders, still spoke of boundaries, still promised trade and non-interference, because the frontier was real, no matter what flag flew in Santiago. But look closer at the 19th century's new engines. Private land hunger, export markets, railroads, and a state that wanted a single map. The language shifted from coexistence to incorporation. Treaties became obstacles. The river's old meaning began to fade. And here comes the bitter twist that refuses romance. The war with Spain did not end because the Mapuche were conquered. Spain left, defeated elsewhere, exhausted, replaced by new states. But pressure did not vanish. In the late 19th century, the Chilean state pushed southward in a campaign known as the occupation of Araucanía. Soldiers, rail lines, and settlers crossed what had once been treated as a treaty boundary. Land was seized, communities were confined, different flag, similar hunger. A republic erased the frontier that once humbled an empire. The Biobío River, that living border, watched the meaning of the frontier change. Under Spain, it was a line the empire could not cross permanently. Under the Republic, it became a line to be crossed and forgotten. Treaties that once forced recognition were treated as inconvenient paper. The land remembers that betrayal too. And still, communities survived, carrying language, ceremony, and political demands into the modern world, where the struggle is often legal and economic, but still rooted in soil, water, and memory. This is why the Mapuche story still unsettles Chilean identity. The nation grew up telling itself it was disciplined, modern, different. Yet its earliest long war was a war it could not win by conquest. The frontier made soldiers, budgets, myths of toughness, and stories of civilization staring into a forest. Later, the same nation used Mapuche courage as a symbol while denying Mapuche rights as reality. The contradiction is still alive, like a river under fog. The land remembers, and so do people. So return one last time to the Spanish fort at dawn. Wet wood, rusting nails. A soldier stares into trees that he does not understand. Across the Biobío, a Toki lifts a lance, not as myth but as a decision. Smoke drifts over Araucania. Somewhere, a treaty table waits under open sky, because sometimes the only way forward is to speak. Spain conquered empires except here, and that exception forced an empire to recognize a frontier. Before Bolivar, before Toussaint, the southern forests were already forcing an empire to treat an indigenous people as a political counterpart, not just as labor. The letters admit it. The battlefield keeps count, the river remembers. And now you carry the story into the present, where endurance still matters, where treaties and borders still echo in arguments over land and dignity. Do you think resistance is defined by victory or by endurance? Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.